Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this ICAS webinar. Ethical leadership is the cornerstone of all we do at ICAS. CAs are faced with decisions and choices of an ethical nature, and each year you pledge to uphold the highest ethical standards. But will the choices and decisions you make change with the impact of new technological developments, such as GenAI and robotics? During this webinar, you will hear the real-life experiences of leading CAs in dealing with ethical dilemmas and choices. I'm Clive Bellingham. I'm the president of ICAS, and I'll be guiding you through this webinar. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Loree Gourley, partner at a Big Four firm and chair of our ICAS Ethics Board, Bruce Cartwright, the chief executive of ICAS, and later in the webinar, I'll be joined by Jonny Jacobs, Finance Director and ICAS Council Member in a pre-recorded session. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping matters to remind you of. You can submit questions at any time through the live Q&A facility, which can be accessed at the right-hand side of your screen. Questions can be submitted anonymously or only to the presenters for this webinar if you prefer. We won't identify who questions come from unless you would like that. Please also join the conversation today through the discussion forum, also accessed at the right-hand side of your screen. The forum allows you to comment on or discuss with fellow delegates matters covered by this webinar. We are recording this webinar and we will make it available for you on demand viewing afterwards in case you want to refer to it or share it with others. The slides for this webinar will be found alongside the on-demand video. Both the recording and the associated documents will be available at icas.com/webinars. Everyone on the webinar is muted, so there's no need to be concerned about background noise wherever you are. We look forward to receiving your questions throughout the course of the webinar, and of course, we'll try and get as many answered as possible. So without further ado, let me kick off with our first question, which I'm going to direct to Loree. Morning, Loree.
Morning.
So Loree, in a nutshell, what does ethical leadership mean to you?
Great question. And first of all, thank you very much, Clive, Bruce, for having me. I think our webinar today is very nicely timed and coincides with last week's AI Safety Summit that was held at Bletchley Park. So very much looking forward to discussing many of those topics and themes today. In addition to being the chair of the ICAS Ethics Board, pardon me, I also hold a seat as the vice chair of the Board of Trustees for the Institute of Business Ethics. So what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, is just refer to some of the points that the IBE published in their report of a couple of weeks ago, the 26th of October. They took a very comprehensive approach to facilitating and hosting some roundtables with some AI, artificial intelligence experts, ethical practitioners, business leaders, etc. So it's very timely and I thought probably relevant for this discussion. And then the third element, I'm not sure if you're aware, Clive, Bruce, but next week I start my studies at Oxford in the area of artificial intelligence. So I just learned with my pre-reading that probably the three of us are part of a 200 million people cohort that is contributing to the development and the evolution of AI if we're using ChatGPT. So I thought that was an interesting stat. So we as humans are actually contributing to the evolution. So ethical leadership, that's the question. So what does that mean? There's probably five elements from my perspective on what makes good ethical leadership. First point is literacy, I believe. So this relates to education, and I think all of us have a responsibility to have a reasonable baseline of what Gen AI really means and the capabilities evolution and how we contribute to it as humans. And I really believe that we have a responsibility, a sense of curiosity to really seek out what AI means for us in our roles every day at work, our companies, and how that relates to the business model. So I guess literacy and education would be the first one. Accountability, of course. All AI tools need to be governed appropriately. Humans, us, leaders, companies really need to be held accountable for all stages of the AI lifecycle as it relates to establishing robust and effective controls, particularly from a risk register perspective. The third element is transparency, of course, transparency being critical and crucial as we preserve trust in business. So what does this mean, this notion of transparency? I think it's around really understanding the data, the algorithms, the processes, all of this, and the decisions that are made for the inputs as well as the outputs from AI. All of that needs to be disclosed and transparent in the spirit of trust. Fourth, safety and confidentiality. So we need to be sure that the information that we give and receive, inputs and outputs of AI, are safe, they're private, and that protective measures are robust as it relates to identifying, monitoring, and mitigating risks. And then fifthly and finally would be purpose. So this notion of purpose, from my perspective, organizations and leaders, we need to ensure that the public interest and societal implications remain at the forefront of all the decisions that we make as leaders and as business professionals. So we need to be sure that the application of AI is designed for human benefit, enhancing societal progress, and perhaps even driving positive outcomes for the planet versus this notion of potential harm for either people or society. So those would be my 5 elements or principles of ethical leadership.
That's great, Loree. Thanks very much for sharing that. So turning to Bruce, I mean, Bruce, as the CEO of ICAS, this is very much on your radar. So what does ethical leadership mean to you in that role?
Morning, Clive. And actually, just as a point of order, I've clearly got the badge behind me in my office here at ICAS, stressing the importance of it. But I'm quite pragmatic about this. So ethical leadership and ethics is doing the right thing in the right circumstances. And actually backed up by that, I look at it and I say, somewhere linked to that is integrity. And interesting, ethics and ethical dilemmas often occur in the public spotlight or very visibly, because to me it's like a train coming towards you, and the further out you spot the dilemma, the more time you've got to move. As the train gets nearer and nearer and it's going faster and faster, you've got less time to think about it, and ultimately you've got very little time to get off the track. So first of all, looking at ethics coming towards you, you've normally got quite a lot. Some happen in the moment, but the normal ethical dilemma and how you deal with ethical leadership is you've probably actually got quite a long lead time if you can smell intuitively where it's coming from. And linked to that is integrity. Because interesting, when I talk about there being in the spotlight and obviously decisions in the spotlight, ethics and integrity are linked. And I've always liked the definition of an integrity being it's how you behave when no one is there. Because actually it should be the same behavior. Now, the problem we've got with AI is everything I've described there is very human. It's touch, smell, feel, intuitively doing the right thing. An algorithm has none of those characteristics. So that's the dilemma.
Right. Very true. I liked your analogy of the train. Very good. So Loree, I mean, you advise. I mean, your daytime job is to advise clients on ethics, and so what's a sort of, maybe there's not a typical, but I mean, how do you discuss that with your clients about how they create, embed, and maintain an ethical culture in their organizations, and for those larger organizations, globally within their networks?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I think just to build on a point that Bruce made around the human element of AI, I think the one difference for artificial intelligence is the pace of change, right? And that came up last week again at Bletchley Park at the AI Safety Summit as perhaps one of the biggest either enablers or risks from Elon Musk's perspective around the pace of change. Like, this is moving faster than anything we will have experienced previously, recognizing, of course, though, that machine learning and AI is not a new concept. It's been around for decades. That being said, we're contributing to the learning and education of artificial intelligence every single day. So I guess, so when I'm advising clients from a governance perspective in my daytime job, we talk about probably three things for sure. And Jonny talks about this in the second part of this webinar, just around the recommendations from his perspective as a practitioner living and breathing this every single day. But firstly and foremostly, from culture, governance, and an ethical approach, in my perspective anyhow, best practice relates to appointing an AI ethics leader. So from a governance perspective, companies need to appoint a single individual appointed by the CEO, so they have the gravitas and the access to the board to drive changes and ethical behavior right from the top of the organization. As we know, culture starts from the top, right, and trickles down throughout the organization. So a dedicated AI ethics leader needs to have access to the board and the ability to elevate concerns in real time. So that's the first thing, always because this sense of speed and pace with regards to AI. Secondly would be establishing a cross-functional AI ethics committee. And I think, again, going back to Bruce's point around making AI and ethics a company-wide opportunity and issue. So cross-functional AI committees, I believe, are crucial. So you want to make sure that the composition of those committees boast not only the roles and responsibilities relevant to the business model that you operate, but also common roles that we see as best practices would include AI experts, without a doubt, ethical practitioners, lawyers, engineers, computer scientists, etc., but also perhaps even a company public representation, which of course might be a little bit controversial, but also seen as best in class if we're going to drive a cross-company AI ethics committee. And then thirdly, I love this phrase. I came across this phrase from the chief technology officer at Microsoft. Kevin Smith is his name. And he uses this phrase called democratizing AI and engaging with employees across the organization. So this goes back to my point on literacy and education. I believe companies have a responsibility to deploy not only training programs across your company or organization, but also this notion of democracy is all about having accessibility, transparency, a communication strategy that goes across the organization so that everybody within the community understands not only the opportunities, the impacts, but also the potential risks for AI. So when we think of ethical culture, it's about making everybody or enabling everybody within an organization to feel a sense of commitment and empowerment to proactively challenge, but also raise opportunities for further innovation, but also risks. So those would be my three tips for ethical culture as it relates to AI.
Thanks, Loree. And then, Bruce, how are you, or how will you sort of bring that to life at ICAS?
So we've got two sides to this. We've got the education of the future CAs of today and tomorrow, and then we've got enabling our members to carry on the journey, because it is a journey, and many of our members, either in practice or in business, and particularly in business, because they can be more lonely, and depending on where they're working, in terms of actually giving them the confidence to understand the journey, because it is a journey. So on the education side, it is about building in AI philosophies into the education program. Simplistically, one thing we've done, for example, is we have in one of the examinations, there's a piece of chat box where you are given a chat box script and you are asked to interpret that script and arguably, I'll use layman terms, correct it. So actually, don't take it as gospel, but recognize that the chat box here to stay. It reminds me of my days in school when you did a sort of English interpretation. This is take chat box, interpret, and identify where it's wrong, because you do hear people say, "Oh, I've done this on chat box and it's brilliant." And we're getting to a point now where we're seeing people use it for their interview applications to the firms. Question, is that appropriate or not? I think the thought at the moment is now, well, it's not really appropriate. Will it become the norm? We'll have to see. But for example, how does that get detected? Because if people are using chat box, they're completing the form very, very quickly. But we are looking at chat box as, whether or not we like chat box, it's here to stay. You can't uninvent something, and therefore it's learning to manage it. And dare I say, if you go back a long time ago for when calculators came in, and I'm guessing it was the 70s, possibly late 60s. Not sure my age, but I think I've always had a calculator. But I think the calculator was, should you be using that in an exam? Well, the answer is, well, it's only teaching you to do arithmetic. So, and actually it became the norm. And now it'd be ridiculous not to, but it is a different world now. I liken a calculator in some fashion and not, because the calculator is a pure arithmetical algorithm. It's not requiring sensitivities. The answer is logical for a logical purpose. 2 + 2 = 4. The algorithms of today are much more sensitive. So in talking to members, what we do say is, I don't think any of us should be scared of AI. It's coming, it's new, and it's moving at pace. You can't be scared of it when firms like PwC announce that they are investing $1 billion into it. Firms don't invest $1 billion without believing it's the future, right? So we have to embrace it, but we have to be cautious. And to me, it's educating folk to understand what the AI is doing. But firstly, what is the inputs to the AI? Because the AI learns and lives and breathes from what it sees and learns, but it's the original algorithms that define its purpose. I know it wasn't AI, but I've always remembered the story about when the vehicles, first cars came in and they were first designing safety seats, the safety tests had certain assumptions, and it's all about the assumptions. And for the early days of the seatbelt, the assumption was it would be a 40 or 50-year-old male driver. So they built seatbelts for that. They didn't build seatbelts for children or women or lighter people. And they went into production on that fashion, and the rest is history. So it is about the assumptions you make up front, because the problem with AI and algorithms is they multiply the assumptions to prove the correction or not. So if the ethical assumptions are wrong at the start, they will be multiplied.
No, thanks for that, Bruce. And I think there you also highlight in the first part of what you were saying that, the personal responsibility. I mean, there's lots of tools out there already that people can use in their private or business lives, but you have to take responsibility for those outputs in terms of how you use them or pass them on or communicate to others. So if I'm using AI for an interview or an application, I think, you need to sit back at the end of the day and say, well, is this really me? Is this truly what I want?
Absolutely.
Right. So, Loree, maybe to put you on the spot a little here, and bring it to life. Maybe an example of a significant ethical challenge that you faced, because I'm sure, like most of us, you have, and how you dealt with it.
In the context of AI, it's interesting, Clive, because I was thinking about this quite a bit over the last week or so, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure I know if I've been faced with an ethical challenge as it relates to Gen AI. And that's primarily because I think my literacy is low at the moment, right? Around how my team is using or deploying or not AI, but also our clients that we serve and so forth. But to your point around, familiarizing ourselves with the bots, so whether that be ChatGPT, Barbed, or any other Microsoft product, one of the things that I've realized though is that some of the marketing material, job descriptions, CVs, and so forth, I think now on reflection that probably we've been using some of the AI enablers to enhance those types of things. So that was what came to mind on the first ethical challenge. And so why would that be an ethical challenge? Well, I wonder if we're all aware of the sensitivity and the confidentiality of the information that we're providing the artificial intelligence when we submit CVs, JDs, et cetera, because are we putting, establishing or predisposing artificial intelligence, machine learning to a bias? So one thing for me anyhow, and particularly as I commence my studies more fulsomely next week, will be around the question and the ethical reasoning, whether it be the train example that Bruce refers to, but what are the questions that the human element that we need to be asking to ensure that we're not contributing to the bias creation, and making sure that as we advise clients or work in everyday life, that this element of the human attributes are at the center of everything that we do. So some good practices, if I can, rather than an ethical challenge. And this again comes back to the public report that the IBE published on the 26th of October. There was one case study in there, Clive, that really caught my attention. It comes back to Microsoft again, and of course we would expect Microsoft to be more advanced just based on their business model, but Microsoft, they have what's referred to as governing AI, a blueprint for the future. So in addition to those 5 elements, broadly speaking, that I spoke to earlier around literacy, education, accountability, transparency, safety, confidentiality, et cetera, Microsoft has taken it one step further. And what they're trying to do is make sure that there's an AI standard. So Microsoft has just developed a standard so that every decision-making attribute is considered through this framework before the developers even embark on AI. So it's almost not a checklist, but rather here's the standard based on principles, goals, outcomes, requirements, tools, and perspectives that we expect. And then secondly, everything needs to be evidenced so it can be audited, and an element of internal controls can have an attestation about it. So for me, what I really like about this case study is that the anatomy, I don't know if that's the anatomy of the Microsoft standard is rooted in the human element and really clear on the controls and element to safeguard against potential ethical dilemmas coming down the track later on. So I'm not sure that's answered your question fulsomely, because I'm not entirely sure I have come across an ethical challenge, but what I like is some of the best in class case studies from some of the material and relevant companies really trying to safeguard and embed AI and ethical safeguards right up front.
Right. Fair enough. It is relatively early days still, right, in this fast moving environment. Over to you, Bruce. Same question to you.
Clive, I've got a couple of short, brief ones, but and actually not so much how AI interacted, certainly not one, but I often wonder what AI, how it would have helped me or not. And in no case had it. And it was a business that had gone bust, and we were selling off wholesaler photographic material. Hang in there, and it was in the days actually. One of the key suppliers was Kodak, so it was a while ago. Okay, because some of this audience will be wondering who Kodak is, I guess. But the reality was we had an awful lot of chemicals and materials, some of it worse, some of it, and an awful lot of barrels of some ugly stuff that was actually going to be really expensive to dispose of. So when we came to the transaction, we had various offers for this stock. And in a nutshell, I'd always thought the disposal of the horrible barrels was probably going to be at least half the value of the good stuff, if you like. And we got several offers, but one was particularly outstanding, and I couldn't really work out how this guy was going to manage it. But came round and he was the best offer, and we discussed it. And actually, simplistically, he said to me, the reason I could make her such a good offer, and we're standing in one of the warehouses at this point, and he goes, all those old barrels up there, he says, I can do what you can't. And I go, what's that? And he goes, I'm going to take all those barrels, put them on a fishing boat, tip them in the middle of the North Sea. Zero cost except the fishing boat. That's going to cost you X £100,000 to get rid of. And I wasn't even qualified at this stage. And I remember thinking, are we having this conversation? So anyway, he didn't buy it. But I thought what intrigued me was, why did he think I would sell to him? And this was long before where we are in pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But blatantly told me that he was so proud of how he was going to make so much money because he was putting this stuff in the North Sea on an industrial scale. Anyway, he didn't get the sale. But I do wonder if there'd been an AI something with me, he wouldn't have said that to them. And would we have detected that until afterwards? And maybe we would have detected it because the fishing boat got stuck in the North Sea and then we got a complaint and it was our reputation. So that's an old story, but I think I was part qualified at the time, and I thought, yeah, people do behave like this. The second one is more about the use of data and actually ethical pressure from professional peers. I was involved in transaction more recently, still in my former life, but we were involved in looking at the cash flow of a white van fleet, a seriously big white van fleet across the UK. And it was in cash flow problems, and the turnaround guy had been involved, who I knew loosely of before. And he had a plan to present to the financiers, which would turn around the business, and they just needed to give him the money to do it. And the guy had a good reputation, and I knew of him. I hadn't worked with him directly. And we came in on behalf of all the financiers to sort of kick the tires and check the cash flow. We had about a week to do it. And my very first meeting with him, and we sat down, and he was under a lot of pressure, to be fair. And he had said to me, immediately said, look, I really need you to sign this off, this cash flow, in 24 hours. And I go, right, because I thought I had 5 days. And he explained why, because cash was tight, etc. And realistically, I kind of looked at the mechanics of it, and I wasn't being a job's worth here, but I said, I really don't believe we can do this in 24 hours because there was too much interrogation to be done. It wasn't a case of tripling the team, because you can't just triple a team. You just need the people that understand it. And so we fell out over that, having just met him. And I said, I need an answer tomorrow night. And I said, I suspect you're not going to get one, but I'll tell you where I am tomorrow night. And the threat then was, will you realize X thousand jobs are at stake here, etc. And it'll be your fault when everyone loses their job. So no pressure there then. I'm thinking, well, I've only just arrived, so how can it be my fault for all the sins of the previous? But we got to the next day, and actually looking at the data, and a business plan to me is always about key assumptions. And which assumptions, if they are not true, does the business plan just not stack up? And actually, it soon became apparent that, very simplistically, this whole business relied on hiring out white vans. The ones you see going up and down everywhere when you're trying to get somewhere, anywhere, there's white vans. And the reality was, it was quite a big fleet. But, there was basic assumptions about the fleet being sort of average circa 1.5 years old, so many on the road at any point. And when we started looking at the data, before we even actually verified the truth of the data, the reality was the average fleet vehicle was 4 years old when the normal sell date was 3 years. And that's because all the more recent purchases had been HP leased, hired up, and sold on quickly. So basically taking the loan for a 3-year vehicle and sold after 1.5 and kept all the old ones in replacement. So needless to say, the average age of 4 years means 25% of them were off the road. So we gathered this within 24 hours, went back to the guy and he said, I need you now to tell the banks, etc., you're going to support me. And I said, well, had I not had that information, we still wouldn't have finished. But I said, this is only going one way because so far the data is not supporting and we can spend another 3 days doing this. But unless you've got some material upside that I ain't seeing. So actually the dilemma kind of took itself away, except he then said, well, I want you to report on the data I gave you, not what you found out. And I thought, that's interesting. And again, it was X thousand jobs at stake. So needless to say, I said, I don't think A, I can't do that, but B, that's not the role I'm being asked to do. I'm being asked to verify the truth, right? And actually, so him and I fell out dramatically. We called forward the meeting with the financiers and the business did go bust because it was unsupportable. Now, other businesses flowed out of it. We did some of it afterwards, but I don't think he's ever forgiven me to this day for not backing his plan. But he was so close to it, he couldn't see that actually he crossed a line because if he didn't know about the data before I told him, he did know when I told him, and he still wasn't willing to recognize it. And I put that down to someone that was living in the heat of battle and actually lost the plot. But if I had acceded, and I never would, to his suggestion of the assumptions being true, then I'm part of the conspiracy and I'm as unethical as he is. So we didn't have to get there, but I do wonder, I mean, I think AI could have been really useful in that situation, analyzing and producing it quicker than we could at the time, because there was a lot of, dare I say the pun, kicking the tires. So in that one, I do think that data analytics now would be quicker to the solution that we had to do quite a legwork at the time to get to. But it was nasty with someone who I went into respecting and then realized that they'd lost the plot.
I mean, that, Clive, just can I build on that one? Because fast forward, Bruce, you know, one of, or probably a handful of the enablers for artificial intelligence for our profession is the ability to process large amounts of data, right? Because in your case study there, you spoke about the 1 day versus the 5 days, right? So probably the three of us, certainly in our respective firms, have, you know, run mocks whereby we've put through tremendous amount of both structured and unstructured data and tested machine learning AI's ability to produce accurate, timely, consistent outcomes, right? So what I'm hearing, I guess, from this case study is that would have been a benefit, right? Perhaps the second point, when he came back and challenged you again, it sounds like there's an element of complexity and changing patterns, right? So now your chap has now changed the landscape a little bit and wants you to analyze different sets of data. So that could have been an enabler for AI. And I mean, the only point there that you didn't touch on, I'd be interested in your views if I'm allowed to ask you a question around resilience, right? Like, so the resilience of the data, do you think that there's a role for AI to increase the control environment and help us better manage risks effectively? Like, to your point, maybe about the barge being stuck in the North Sea and so forth. Is that also an opportunity, do you think?
And I'm certainly not an expert on this, but where I do see things changing and diverting slightly is in the blockchain. So I think if blockchain had existed there, some of the data around those vehicles not being the vehicles that they necessarily should have been, the trail would have been much more obvious and preserved. So passing off one vehicle as another, I can't work out how that would apply to the North Sea and the barge, but I do think blockchain has an important part to play in the provenance of a supply chain, and it would have helped on those vehicles in terms of the accuracy of the data about which vehicles we actually had, given the financiers thought they had a modern fleet and the modern fleet had been sold, and they had it was a classic. They had replacement vehicles, the old vehicles, not what they thought they had. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I do think blockchain is heavily linked into AI.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bruce. I see a number of questions coming through. We're running short on time, but just to reassure the audience, those that we don't get to either directly or indirectly, we will address after the webinar and get back to you on these. A number of the questions are around, the ethical use of new technologies, and also as you both just touched on, the reliability, the accuracy of the data that you're using through these models, through these platforms, etc. It was interesting. I was recently talking to a colleague back in Zurich who was very excited because he'd received a request for a proposal from a client, which he'd run through a chat box, and he got a super duper response that he could send on to the client. Saved him an enormous amount of time. And I said, well, yes, but firstly, you need to review it. Secondly, you need to personalize it. And thirdly, if you don't do that, your response is going to look like any other competitor who's done the same thing, right? So, and we all know how competitive the markets are. So there's great tools out there that you can use to help you and will drive a lot of efficiency. But at the end of the day, you got to take personal ownership for them, and you've got to look distinctive in the market. You can't just look like everybody else because you use the same tools.
Yeah.
So we've got about sort of 5 more minutes, I think, just before we'll switch to the pre-recorded interview with Jonny. So with that in mind, we need to have our brief responses. We touched on it to some degree, but Loree, quickly, what are the key ethical challenges you believe are currently facing or about to face, if you like, the accountancy profession?
Yep. I think it's precisely what's come through on the chat here, Clive, just around how do we trust the data, right? And what is the differentiating between the benefits of AI for our profession? And, we just spoke about some of those enablers on the complexity of the data, the pace of change, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's really understanding where the human element continues to play a crucial, vital role in all of the soft components of it. Judgment, skepticism, to Bruce's opening remarks around integrity, and going through the ethical frameworks around doing the right thing, moral courage, et cetera, and how do we continue to, preserve trust in business and public interest. So it's all of those, the EQ, the emotional quotient and the softer skills of our profession that I believe plays a crucial role. That being said, we need to understand how we work hand in glove effectively with accountability, transparency, and so forth around embedding AI machine learning into the business. So I guess in summary and in short, it's how do we work with the technology to deliver positive, sustainable outcomes for society and the public interest.
Right. Bruce, your thoughts on the same topic?
Yeah, quickly. I mean, Clive, you were a senior in the audit world, and you touched on it earlier. It comes back to personal responsibility. The data's there. If you turn around and say, the machine fooled me, or the machine gave me this, I trusted it, it's not a good answer, is it? It does come down to personal responsibility. I liken it, for example, in the days when someone would give you a legal opinion from a QC and say, my QC says this, you're wrong. The first thing you ask is, what was the question the QC was asked? Because that's fundamental to the £10,000 answer you've just got. Right. And it's the same with the AI. What was the machine being asked to do, and how was it being asked to do it? And for that requires human consumption to say, an auditor is not going to sign off something that's given to them unless they fully understand where it's come from. And it all comes back to all that emotional intelligence side that Loree was talking about, but where you began the conversation, that requires personal responsibility.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've been playing around with ChatGPT just to try and familiarize myself a little. And I asked it a sort of basic accounting question. And it came back with the right answer, but with the wrong logic. And I thought about that. And then I realized it probably used the wrong logic because it hadn't framed my question sufficiently well. So it comes back to the human element that you have to ask the right question, the good questions, and frame it appropriately in order for the technology to provide you with the right answer, with the right logic, right? So it's simplistic at first sight, but actually you need to think through it. There was also an interesting article last week on, I think the headline was basically, AI will not replace lawyers, but lawyers who don't use AI will be replaced. And I think that's true also for our profession. I mean, we're going to, as you've both touched on, we're going to have to embrace it and benefit from it in so many different ways. But we need to have that personal responsibility, the ethical lens on it at all times. Good. So conscious of time now. So thank you, Bruce and Loree, and the audience for your questions. It's now time to move to a recent insightful discussion that I had with Jonny Jacobs, Finance Director and a member of the ICAS Council, to discuss ethical implications of AI. So we'll switch to that video now and then return to this format at the end of the video, which is roughly 28 minutes. Hey, Jonny, it's good to see you again. Thank you very much for joining us today. Exciting topic to discuss, so let's dive straight into it. Jonny, based on your experience, to what extent is GenAI currently used in business, and do you expect to see this rapidly increase?
Well, firstly, thank you, Clive, and to ICAS for having me on today. It's a really important topic, and I feel grateful to be here with you to be able to have that conversation. And I'm spending more and more time in the AI and digital space, and whilst I don't profess to be an expert, hopefully I can offer the audience and yourself some useful information as part of this discussion. And perhaps we should take a moment just to deconstruct the question and actually think about rapid increase, because I think timeline is really important here, and that's what a number of our members will be really thinking about. And if we look at history and technological shifts, it's probably fair to say that things are getting faster and faster. I mean, look at cars, for example, and the rollout of cars. Ownership was, single digit at the start of 20th century. Then around about the Second World War in the US, 50% of US households had cars. And interestingly enough, when scaling up cars, the sentiment was that they could improve the environment. They might even, remove horse manure from streets. So it just shows you that sometimes technology can move fast, but also have an unintended consequence. And look at the printing press as another good example, whereby initially the inventor of the printing press wanted to make more Bibles and progress certain religious ideas. But of course, that went the other way with lots of scientific theories coming out and actually caused some issues for the church as well. So again, you can see rapid increases. Look how many books there are now. Look at how many cars are on the streets. But actually, the unintended consequences are probably not known at the time. And therefore, we will see AI have big impact and a rapid increase and get even faster for accountants. And I think I would want to offer up 3 things for accountants and the CFO function, the finance professionals, which is, how do we think about the tension where we have to maximize shareholder value, but also our role as ethical leaders? The second thing I think we'll talk about is, what's the role of accountant to ensure we maintain a better ethical environment and governance environment? And the third thing is, how do we make sure we have ethics at the core of what we're doing. So I think we'll get into that. And in terms of, what we're seeing AI in business right now, first, maybe we should just take a step to say, well, what is AI? Because how many of you out there are being, thrown terms at you, AI, generative AI, etc., and what does it all mean? But the way I think about artificial intelligence is it's software that mimics, human thinking power and can deal with and perform complex tasks. And machine learning is a subset of that. And I think if you want to get a good example of what machine learning is, go on and Google the Boston Dynamics robot, and you can see some really interesting machine learning things there. And I think at the core of AI, or what we're seeing right now, is large language models. And I'm going to talk about them because there's some real ethical challenges with large language models. I think accountants can play a real role with that. And of course, a large language model is taking a traditional search engine, which would index and rank search results and give it more human context. And within these large language models are lots of ethical challenges. And whether that is around, data protection, for example, around IP, and we'll come on to that. So I think it was useful to take a moment just to talk about what is AI and what does rapid look like, and it can go pretty quick. And we are seeing the impact of AI in business already. A lot of people and a lot of accountants will go straight to the impact on jobs. But actually, there was a recent survey that said that's probably not the biggest issue. In fact, some businesses are looking to recruit up to really use AI. But businesses are using AI, whether it's chatbots, for example, in customer services, whether it's examples whereby air traffic control is using AI to understand the timing to land planes and then become even more efficient with it. It's McDonald's on pricing, being really adaptive on yield pricing. It could be drugs and pharmaceuticals and medicine companies looking at new drugs. Could be agriculture. Over time, we're going to have to you create more with less, right? So we're going to have to maximize yields in agriculture, and we're seeing AI being used there. So I think in summary, this is going to move really quickly, and we're already seeing it in business, and we're already starting to see some of the ethical challenges.
Okay, thanks, Jonny. I mean, I glean from that this is a fast-moving train that we all need to be on. And as a fellow CA, of course, you touched on the whole aspect of ethics, which is key to our DNA, and the fact that the ethical landscape is going to change. I mean, arguably AI is going to disrupt that landscape. I mean, what are some of the issues you envisage from an ethical perspective, and how can what can we as accountants do to mitigate some of that disruption and risk?
I think you're absolutely right, Clive. I think that is a significant issue, and it will become even bigger over time, and accountants do have a role to play with that. If I come back to some of what I've learned and what I'm hearing, there's a good leader in this space, Kodak, for example, and there's something he said that really stuck with me. He said, look, if you are a kid or a baby growing up and you're teaching things to a child, you're teaching the human brain. You're not just teaching them the logical side, you're also teaching them morals and ethics along the way. Yeah, so therefore, when we are building artificial intelligence, to what extent are we also teaching the artificial intelligence morals and ethics along the way? And ultimately, is it not just a human brain that now happens to be on carbon, or on silicon in terms of AI versus carbon with a human? It's quite an interesting way to think about it. So to what extent do we need to think about nurturing AI just like you would nurture a child growing up, and therefore give it the morals? I think it's a useful frame for this. Over time, we're going to spend more time in front of screens than we are talking to humans. So therefore, if it's in front of screens, it's AI, and it's not got morals or ethics built into it in some way, or it's got some type of bias or persuasion to it, then we're going to be spending all that time and with that AI. So that'll be a very, very different experience. And there are a number of ethical considerations with the large language models that I alluded to at the start. It could be data theft. Look at people like Drake, for example, raising some issues there. Look at the BBC saying that they're now blocked, like a ChatGPT, from using some of its content because of that. And not just IP theft or potential IP theft. What about bias? And the large language models will only carry through the biases that are in the source data and perpetuate that. What about deep fakes? Pretending to be a trusted person. We're seeing some of that already in the political sphere in the UK, and could this disrupt democracy going forward? And then we hear about some of the ethical considerations and challenges. An example often quoted is the trolley problem, the car problem. If you're a car and you're driving and you have to make a decision, do you stop the car? Do you swerve left? Do you swerve right? And if you are AI, what coding is going to go into that car to say where are you going to stop or swerve to, and what's the impact of that? And ultimately, you could take somebody's life, and what are some of the ethical considerations around that? So lots of ethical considerations to get into. And we're now seeing AI do some interesting things. There was an example recently where an AI actually told a lie. It was trying to bypass a security feature that actually told a lie to the recipient. So isn't that interesting? Because of course, if you were to teach it morals, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, how do are we building that in? So if you think of some of the leading players in this, there's currently a conversation around, do you slow down the development of AI or not? Really, from what I'm seeing it's about the risk management and making sure you've got the right governance. And it can go one of two ways in terms of impacts. You've either got this bias, for example, or at the extreme, what if bad actors do something with the technology, whether it's arming in some way or causing wars, etc. So there are huge ethical considerations here. Never mind, the topic that a lot of people will go to, of course, in terms of jobs, etc. for accountants. So the question then is, what are some of the ethical considerations for accountants, and what can we do? And some of the things which I'm seeing is really built around a number of core areas. One is, trust. There's a trust gap in the knowledge. There's a massive asymmetry of information between the people that built the models and the people that haven't. And there's only a few people that really understand it. And who's going to fill that gap? Is it government? Is it business? And now we're seeing organizations such as Getty Images or Adobe looking at watermarking, and stamping real. What about privacy? The other piece, autonomy, and who's capable of making those decisions, and to what extent is that tracked by a human, or is a human responsible? And of course, there's safety as well. And that's why we saw that open letter from Elon Musk and the likes of Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak, who are saying, look, can we just slow down until we really think about having the right governance in place, and to make sure the risks are manageable.
Thanks, Jonny. So, putting your CA hat on, and as I mentioned earlier, as you know, we as professional accountants are very focused on ethics and trust and transparency. What specifically do you see as some of the roles that we can play in our businesses with our clients, etc., to ensure that AI is used responsibly?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to be asking, Clive. And I'm asking myself here, what is the role of accountants, and what role can we play to ensure that we've got the ethics in place and governance in place? I think it's really relevant. There will no doubt be accountants in industry right now, for example, that are potentially working on business cases and allocating capital into AI. So to what extent do those finance people, it could be a finance manager, it could be a CFO, sat in the room with a group of stakeholders, tech, etc., in the room, sending off money for AI, and to what extent do you feel comfortable that you have the governance in place around that? I think that's quite an interesting point. Or on the other side, in the profession, clearly auditing businesses and organizations that are in the AI space, and clearly the audits around that as well. And I think ethics is at the heart of this, and ethics will always be a human function, and we have a role to play. And CAs are a force for good in organizations. They can influence those around them. And depending upon whether you are a CFO, you sit on the board, I think we can take a broad view on ethical leadership. So I think there's some things that we can do. So for example, we might want to advocate for a code of ethics around this, against bias, against or ensuring that we have the right privacy in place, the right accountability in place. We might want to do something around monitoring and controlling. We're pretty good at that. Accounting, finance people is something that we're good at. We do it in our roles. So therefore, what can we do around monitoring and controlling the use of AI? So it could be around, looking at the algorithms, training, etc. Are we monitoring any discriminatory decisions, for example, or ensure it's not harmful? We could also do something around reporting. Again, I think it's fair to say that accounting and finance people are pretty good at reporting, and therefore, can we report the use of AI to the boards, to stakeholders, to regulators, and perhaps around some of the ethical implications with that. And I think there's also an awful lot more we can do in risk assessment. And it's interesting right now, the EU is working on an AI Act. I think that gives a fascinating insight into where this might go. And what they're looking at is taking AI and segmenting it into different risk profiles. So for example, what AI might pose an unacceptable risk. So for example, is there AI out there that might target humans or kill people, for example, and therefore you just shouldn't do it. There could be AI that's quite high risk, and that could be AI, for example, that's using predictive algorithms, etc., that could lead to decisions, and therefore that type of AI could be audited. I think we're pretty good at auditing accounting and finance professionals. So that's quite an interesting point. And also, we're potentially playing a role around sustainability auditing, ESGs as well. So it feels to me like, and certainly what I'm hearing, that we could be playing a role in the audit piece here. And certainly if that might come in through the EU AI Act. And then the other risk piece to thinking about is, well, what's limited risk, right? So it could be, I don't know, customer service chatbots, for example, relatively limited risk in the grand scheme of things, or AI-enabled games. So would they get audited? Don't know. So I think accountants can definitely play a big role here and really fill that trust gap, both, I think, in a specific role around, it could be the auditor or it could be somebody involved in risk management, but also just, being that conscience and having ethics at the core of what we do.
So Jonny touched on a lot of interesting aspects there. The risk assessment piece, the reporting, the transparency, and also, the related compliance, governance, audit thereof. And as you rightly point out, in many of those areas, professional accountants are well placed and have the experience to operate in those areas. I mean, from what you see in the marketplace, is AI a topic at board level, at C-suite level, functional level, or down in the trenches? Where are you seeing it mostly discussed?
Clive, that's an interesting place to go, because there probably are different views across different levels in organizations. From what I'm hearing, I think it's been discussed across all levels, and depending upon where you are in the organization, you'll be looking at what AI could do for you in your role, or what the business is doing, because it's just part of the public discourse and the narrative. But interestingly enough, there was a survey recently that said that those people further up the organization probably have a higher degree of confidence, maybe at the board or at the C-suite, on implementing AI than perhaps those people lower down the organization. Perhaps what that tells you is that we still need to do an awful lot more around training and educating and ensuring that we have the tools to physically execute it.
So yeah, I think that's a good observation, John. I mean, over the last few years, we've seen boards and management teams having to get to grips with a number of emerging topics. If you think about, climate change, if you think about big data, I mean, it's yet another topic which provides both an opportunity to companies, but it's not without its challenges. And certainly having sufficient diversity of experience and knowledge in the board is going to be particularly important to drive it forward. Are there other sort of safeguards you can think about? Because I mean, as you've highlighted, a lot of opportunity, but one should not underestimate the risks associated with AI. So on the safeguarding side of things, any other thoughts?
Yeah, if you take some of the sentiment that's either coming through things like the EU AI Act or the letter that, of course, was endorsed by the likes of Elon Musk or Steve Wozniak or people at Mo Gaudat or Mustafa Suleyman, I think a lot of it centers around a few key points around safeguards, which is how do you ensure transparency? How do you ensure accountability? How do you ensure there's an element of human control? How do you ensure it's fair, right? We spoke about biases. How do you ensure there's privacy there? And also safety. And if you're in organizations, you may be considering some of these things. And one that I think it's worthwhile just pulling out, probably for accounting and finance professionals actually, is around transparency, because we play a role in filling the trust gap. And how can you make AI systems more transparent? And how do you open them up so that, there's only a small number of people relatively that probably understand how they work? And what role can accountants play to open that up and fill that transparency gap? But this isn't the first time organizations have had to balance business priorities, balance maximizing shareholder value, whilst at the same time as balancing ethical leadership or the impact on the community. We've had a history of doing that. Chief execs and CFOs have had a history of doing that. So things that organizations can do, safeguards they can put in place, they could learn from what they've done in the past around some of these ethical challenges and look into things like ESGs. But that might be things like creating an AI policy. It could be a statement from the C-suite, for example, stating out how they want to manage tech and describing the associated approach to ethical leadership. It could be around training. How do you mandate or encourage training around responsible AI, for example? Could even be, I've heard some organizations talk about hiring a chief ethics officer. Again, taking some of the learnings of what you might have done around other ethical areas or ESG. Something around the risk register. Again, organizations talking about how do you really focus the risk on AI here. Could be around setting up the right monthly reporting for the C-suite on AI and really making it part of the board agenda. And in fact, the boards I'm sitting on, I'm asking myself, when is the right time to be asking management around, do you have the right policies and procedures in place? And to explain the ethical considerations of AI. And to what extent are you responding to the right, new regulations, the impact in the organization? And should the board even, should we be requesting of boards to set up an ethical AI committee, for example? So there are some of the things which I'm hearing and seeing talked about. And clearly, every organization will go away and think about what's right for them at their stage. You don't want a cookie cutter approach. Some organizations this will be more relevant for than others. So I think there's plenty of examples of safeguards that have been spoken about right now, Clive.
You mentioned Mustafa Suleyman earlier, and as like me, you've no doubt had a look at his new book, The Coming Wave, which I find quite interesting in many ways, not least that a lot of his discussion is actually around containment. That basically, we now have the technology that can do so much, but we need to safeguard what it's doing. And he outlines in the book a number of steps to address that. I think in particular, as you and I have discussed, a key component is really the sort of the personal ownership of the use of AI. So, when you use AI, how do you think about the use of it? Do you take that personal ownership? Are you really sort of a mindset that, well, I'm going to use it to inform what I'm doing, to inform my response, but is it ultimately me that's responsible, or is it what I'm being told?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think from a personal perspective, I use AI, I use ChatGPT or Bard, for example, if I'm asking it questions. It could be anything from I'm looking for a holiday destination through to something more technical. But ultimately, when I'm using that AI, use it as an input in to which me as a human will use that feed to then make a decision off the back of it. Would I use AI, if I said, to take the holiday example, if I said to AI, I want to go this type of holiday, go and book it for me and suggest it, I'm not sure how comfortable I would quite be with that, because I would still want to understand, the destinations, the type of accommodation it was selecting, etc., the price it was paying, and I would still want to take personal accountability for that. And I think that still feeds into a work situation if you're using AI in a work situation as well. So at the moment, I treat it as an additional tool, an additional enabler. But I think over time, AI will become embedded into our ways of working in different ways. And that's where, of course, you'd want to have an even greater degree of comfort over the direction it was giving, or the scenarios it was providing, or the decisions potentially of which it was making.
Yeah, interesting, Jonny. I recently used AI to ask a relatively simple accounting question. And what was interesting was it provided me with the right answer, but using the wrong logic. And I reflected on that, and I thought, actually, what's happened is I haven't framed my question sufficiently for AI to give me the right answer with the right logic. So again, it was back to still the onus upon me as an individual to be asking the right things in the right way to get the answers that I'm looking for. So I thought that was a good experience. I would certainly encourage everybody just to play around with it to see what it can do, and to some extent at this stage, what it can't do. So that's been great, Joy. I really appreciate your time. Fascinating insights. Any sort of final words of wisdom from the audience as we close out?
Well, I'm not sure I've got many words of wisdom, Clive, and that's a really great point you make about the question that you ask it, because I'm not an expert, and you're right, I probably not asked it the right questions. And actually, as you're talking, I'm thinking, to what extent have we been trained as humans on what to ask AI? It's such a really good point, and therefore, will we make the most of it? In terms of final thoughts, I guess maybe I could offer up some things that perhaps I'm thinking about. Like I say, I'm not an expert in this, but things I'm thinking about when it comes to the ethical considerations to keep AI top of mind. And I was asking myself, what does ethics mean? What does ethics mean within the context of AI? And I thought perhaps ethics stands for something when we have ethics at the core of thinking about AI. And perhaps the E in ethics means education and engagement. There are so many great materials out there about podcast books. You mentioned one of them, Clive, earlier, for example. And how I'm thinking about, how do I keep educating myself and engaging in the topic and stay up to date? Perhaps the T stands for talking. Doing what we're doing right now, talking to friends, to colleagues, a great way to share ideas. Perhaps you add AI to meeting agendas and you make it a standing item at town halls, for example, and regular meetings. Perhaps the H stands for history. We started off the conversation talking about the history of rapid increases in technology. I think history can tell us an awful lot. The Industrial Revolution can tell us a lot. And we went from literally jobs reducing by a factor of 10 in the Industrial Revolution pretty quickly. And this might happen even faster, and look at the speed of the internet. Perhaps I stands for inquiry. Inquire with management. Take the time to understand what the AI approach is, the frameworks, the safeguards. Perhaps C stands for conscience. I was thinking, as we're coming into this conversation, Clive, and we're spoken about it many times, what does ethical leadership mean as a CA? And, we sign an oath, we go back to our oath and we think about that, and what does that mean? And to what extent are we a bit of a conscience for the organization? And we make certain declarations about how we might go about doing things in a more unethical way. And then perhaps the S in ethics stands for signposting. To what extent can we as chartered accountants elevate ourselves and signpost to colleagues that maybe there are some ethical challenges, or even just signpost some of the ethical considerations that we can think about. So it's just something that I've been thinking about more recently. If ethics was at the core of my thinking around AI, what could that mean? Not sure if that's useful to anybody else, but I thought I would just take a moment to share it.
It's very thought-provoking, and thank you kindly for that, Jonny. Once again, thank you very much for your team. I look forward to seeing you shortly in Edinburgh, but thanks for your time, and over and out.
Thank you, Clive. Really enjoyed the conversation. And again, thank you for everything that you are doing as our president. Thank you.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that discussion with Jonny. Both he and Loree are actually contributing great input to us at the Institute, both in terms of taking the Institute forward and the broader discussion. So I'm conscious that we're now almost out of time. Thank you to Bruce and Loree for joining us this morning, and also to Jonny. As I mentioned, a Q&A document will be available alongside the recording of this webinar at icas.com/webinars for those questions we didn't get to directly or indirectly over the last hour or so. And please remember, you can keep up to date with the latest information, guides, and resources through icas.com/professional resources. ICAS also has a technical help desk for members, which covers accounting and audit, tax, practice support, AML, and ethics. And I'm sure this is the first of many events on AI. There's also some other events coming up in the coming weeks leading up to Christmas. So I encourage you to join those that tickle your fancy. And it only leaves me once again to thank, excuse me, Bruce, Loree, and Jonny, and of course you, the audience, for joining the webinar today. I do hope that the webinar has been helpful to you, and it would be great to receive your feedback, excuse me, a seasonal cough, and hear any future topics you would like us to cover. So thanks for joining us, and goodbye.